This is GBS, and now a very special MMB update.
Hello everyone, did you miss me? Anyways, welcome to the first MMB update to use text-to-speech voices. I know life currently sucks for me, and trust me, I think you all know why. And if you ask, no, I do not have the coronavirus. Can't get demonetized if you don't monetize your videos. Wink wink, nudge nudge. Anyways, remember this happening.
Well, first things first, I am now at 59 subscribers, yay!
Well, it's safe to say that I now have
double the amount from 59 to 110 subscribers. Yay, 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 yay.
In all seriousness, thank you so much for subscribing to my channel. It's been a pleasure creating content for you guys for over 5 years. This is not the end, though, as it's only the beginning of a new era. More on that later. Now on to today's stories. As you all may know already, I have been a student at Onondaga Community College for 4 semesters. I started in the spring of 2019 and now I'm in my fall 2020 semester, with 1 more semester to conquer, and that is spring of 2021. I'm having a little bit of trouble with that, though. First off, my required Computer Information Systems class, CIS 230, Website Design and Development, is no longer available. So, I need to get in touch with Rich Speakielso for me to take part in the alternative, that being CIS 231, Advanced Web Servers. I took CIS 130, Foundations Have the Internet. So I need to tell him about that prereq information. Second, EMC 286, DVD Thoring, is a 50-50 split. The reason for that is that Mark told me that this program is no longer available due to outdated technology, and the alternative for that is BMC 110, Mobile Media. All my other classes, B1, are set to go. The main conflict for this is the times. You see, my R224, designed for multimedia class on Tuesday, starts at 9:05 a.m. and ends at 12:10 p.m. That might not seem to be the problem at first, but then you go to the other classes. BMC 110 starts at 11:10 a.m. and ends at 12:35 p.m. That's only if the MC 286 is discontinued. But it doesn't end there. CIS 231 starts at 1:30 p.m. and ends at 3:20 p.m., which conflicts with the MC 286, if available. EMC 286 starts at 1:30 p.m. and ends at 3:55 p.m. My advisors are trying to find times that don't conflict with each other, but for now, this is what I have. Starts at 1:30 p.m. and ends at 3:55 p.m. My advisors are trying to find times that don't conflict with each other, but for now, this is what I have. Next, I would like to announce that the Epic Logo Countdowns, Top 30 Film and TV Logos Parts 5 and 6 are coming soon. Why, you may ask? Well, 1, I made my own top 10, and 2, it's about time I finish this. The Top 30 Film and TV Logos Part 5 will be released November 21st, which is my brother Dylan's 19th birthday, and Part 6 will be the first video I will post in 2021. I can finally finish this project and move on to the next thing. And now on to that biggest story, and that is the new beginning of MMB Productions. Remember these 9 shots in the intro? I am officially proud to announce that there will be a new YouTube anime series called Mega Man Chronicles GX03, Victory Road. The original idea for this series came from a YouTube user named Nagio, who has this similar boss series called Happy Tree Friends Harmony. The story for this series goes like this. A group of 5 Maverick Hunters would appear in front of the headmaster of the Maverick Hunter Society Guardian Angels to become the god of life, or death. They get to choose who lives and who dies, the 5 being Brandon Germain, his wife Cheyenne Miller, his son Jared, his friend Austin Carlson, better known as Zero, and the leader of the Guardian Angels, and series main character Hunter Dolber. The inspiration for this character comes from Codename user Richie Bertie's series Life with / Without Dollars, which itself is based off of the PBS kids show Caillou. The 3rd season, called Fast Forward, stars a similar Hunter character named Hunter Martin Anderson. The plan is called the Victory Road Project, and with this, peace will be restored to the world. However, there was one other person who was hell-bent on destroying this project. You see, there was one more angel of the group of 5 that the headmaster admired, and strangely, he was the only one who avoided becoming a god. His spirit was different than any other angel. In fact, he wasn't an angel at all. He was much more sinister than that. The legend wrote him out. The demon. The Dark Lord. The 6th man. His name is Neo. And he's the main antagonist of this series. This is not the Neo from the Matrix voiced by Mr. John Wick himself, Keanu Reeves. This character is based with a demagogue and super egotistical personality. Even more egotistical than Sigma. Here they do in part 3 of the prologue. Part 1 of the prologue will have Hunter meeting another character, where he will have feelings for later in the series. This person is also the famous Sonoromogram user, who saw her own family killed by Zed and Megan in GX0, Prodigy rewritten. That's right. This is Rose Carlson, son of Austin Carlson and Jordan Cole. This character is based off of the YRGDHD anime, Caillou SC/GX0. In that series, the Rose character was named Rose Toller, and her family from another dimension, similar to Caillou's family, are attacked by the Shadow Architect, Zed, killing off every member of that family, starting with the younger brother, followed by her mother sacrificing herself by freezing time, figuratively and literally. Then her grandfather died, and after that, she escaped to the other dimension, where Caillou and Rose's counterpart, 10-year-old Rosie Anderson lives, and that series goes on from there. Rose Carlson's overall design is a reference to 4-time WWE Women's Champion, Rebecca Quinn, better known as Becky Lynch. The black and yellow jumpsuit was Lynch's default attire ever since WrestleMania 35. From there, both of them team up to stop Neo and defeat him once and for all. I'd to have one more thing to add though. Remember the relationship between HTF character Giggles and HTF fan character Snowers? Well, that's Hunter and Rose's relationship, but cramped up to 11. These 9 shots come from a scene in part 2 of the prologue, where Rose dies in the Guardian Angels headquarters after being impaled by one of the Angel Guard's spears, because she wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. The scene is sad, yes, but after seeing what happened, Hunter completely loses it, and attacks everyone there. Think of Giggles' death in HTF. Harmony Prologue Part 2 is an inspiration. Same thing happens there, but with different characters. This scene allows the viewer to get connected with the characters. I made a similar scene, but from True Love Never Dies 1, True Statements, where my series character dies after being stabbed by Shadow Sigma Sword. The whole idea for the scene came from fanfiction mega user Matt1251, who had a story about Mario characters Toad and Toadette battle large villains from the Mario series, like Flawful, for example. In that story, Toadette gets killed in the same fashion of this scene. Both scripts have the Death Heroes revived by a sword of light. Most of the characters are done and the script is halfway complete. When all of that is done, I will create the necessary scenes and get the TTS voices for Prologue Part 1. I will be making a character information guide in the future using them 2.10 and Google Slides. My other project, that being the Madden NFL 2001 Team Information Guide, will be put on hold until further notice. I'm also in the process of creating the intro for the series, and a trailer will be coming November 21st for the series, so stay tuned. Well, that's all for this update. This is Brandon Germain signing off.